Influencing popular culture, politics, and everything in between. The local station takes you ringside as we discuss the crazy world that is professional wrestling. This is Going Ringside with The Local Station.
Hello there, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Going Ringside. So glad you could be with us. I'm your host, Scott Johnson, as we unpack this crazy world of pro wrestling. Continue to spread the word for us anywhere you can. Family or friends who like wrestling, or if you're online wrestling groups, please let them know we're out here. This is episode 36, if you're watching in order. Before we go further, I want to talk about last week's episode 35. $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase, wrestling legend Bronson Reed, Raw superstar, had both men on. It was a great episode. That $1 Million Man interview was really good. He talked a lot about how Vince McMahon came up with his gimmick of a rich heel that everyone would hate, goes into talk about problems he had with infidelity and reconciling with his wife, turning his life over to the ministry, becoming one of the biggest ministers in the country. And he also talks about a very newsworthy item, the federal indictment of his son, Ted Jr., and the federal investigation of his family. If you want to hear what he has to say, take a look back right now at episode 35 of Going Ringside. Also, Bronson Reed giving us some great stuff, talking about making his way out of Australia, coming over to Florida, where he lives now, down near us, and going from NXT and now becoming a superstar on Raw. So good interview there as well. You can go check it out in the archives right now, episode 35. We got a couple things in store today. A little later on in the show, we are going to take up the debate of the greatest wrestling manager of all time, after something Paul Heyman had to say, very mean-like, about Bobby the Brain Heenan. You want to scroll ahead if you want to hear that debate about who is the GOAT of wrestling managers. But something has happened in the last few weeks that has really taken wrestling by storm, because it brings in some of the biggest mainstream non-wrestling celebrities in the world today are being sucked into the wrestling world, whether they want to or not. Put them on the screen right now. I am talking about the power couple of the entertainment and NFL world. That would be Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift, and talks that they've been dating. Taylor, of course, has been to all those Kansas City Chiefs games, and the NFL cannot put her on screen enough, as they're rumored to be in a relationship. And Travis Kelce is everywhere right now on all the major commercials. Taylor Swift is obviously maybe the biggest music star in the world right now. So what happened? Well, it involved a star on WWE Smackdown named Grayson Waller. So Grayson Waller, good star for SmackDown, rather. He used to be on NXT, was drafted to SmackDown earlier this year, and he's had a lot of good stuff. He's had some face-offs with John Cena, with Edge before he left WWE. He's been involved in some good angles. So Grayson Waller is a good, solid star for SmackDown right now. But let's be honest. What is a wrestling star in the general world of celebrities? Unless you're The Rock or John Cena, historical guys maybe like Austin or Hulk Hogan, you're not an A-list celebrity. Good, solid wrestlers are maybe B-list, C-list celebrities. It just is what they are. In wrestling, they're A-list. All the wrestling fans love them and talk about them. But outside of wrestling, they're not that well known. So what does Grayson Waller do? He decides to pick somewhat of an online feud with arguably the biggest celebrity couple on the planet right now. Not a bad idea when you're trying to promote yourself. So he goes on to WWE's The Bump podcast, and he's asked about Travis Kelce. There's been rumors Travis Kelce, the star for the Kansas City Chiefs, is a wrestling fan. So he says a quote, a soundbite, I'm going to read that for you right now, that set the internet on fire. This is what he had to say. Now, generally, if you say something on a podcast and you're a wrestler, you can set wrestling world on fire. But seldom does it bleed over into mainstream publicity. Grayson Waller figured out how to do that when he said this. Hey, good for Trav. Like, I'm not the kind of guy that would settle for a 6, but to each their own. Me personally, I like a bit of spice. So he essentially in that soundbite called Taylor Swift, arguably the biggest singer on the planet, a 6. That set everyone off. That got attention. That got a lot of Taylor Swift fans going on X and wherever to criticize this guy, Grayson Waller, for calling Taylor Swift a 6. And what did he do with that? Well, he did something that was really smart. He doubled down and he played into it. Grayson Waller is a heel, and it is his job as a performer to piss people off, to tick people off, to make them angry, and make them not like you, make them boo you, make them want to hate you. And he's really good at doing that with the Smackdown audience, but he just found a whole mega audience out there who don't follow wrestling who are now following him. And they're angry at him for calling Taylor Swift a 6. So what does he do? He sees the writing on the wall. He's got something here. Seldom do wrestlers do something in the wrestling world that triggers the outside world, outside of that wrestling bubble, the general entertainment industry. So I'm arguing in very smart fashion from a PR perspective. Grayson Waller went on and apologized. I'm using the quote marks right now because you're about to listen to what's not really an apology. Let's show, after everything blew up, within 48 hours, what Grayson Waller went on X, formerly Twitter, and said to the fans of Taylor Swift. Here it is.
It's been a crazy 24 hours. I know a lot of people are upset about a joke I made on the bump about Taylor Swift. And a lot of those people are new to me, don't know who I am. So for those people, my name is Grayson Waller, the hottest superstar in WWE right now. Madison Square Garden main eventer, host of the Grayson Waller Effect. And to sum everything up, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you define yourself by another woman and her accomplishments. It's kind of sad, to be honest. Now I got all these swamp donkeys in my DMs saying mean things, saying I'm a 0 out of 10. Hey, leave the wrestling to the professionals. Stick to trading friendship bracelets like a bunch of 4-year-olds, Oh, Taylor's cat has more money than you. First of all, only 2 types of people have cats: witches and crazy old cat ladies. Second of all, with all this negativity going around, I think it's time for someone to bring some positivity. And that's what I do. I bring positivity, I'm an inspirational guy. So for anyone who's had to deal with this before, I just need you to know that the haters are gonna hate. Hate, hate, hate. So all you gotta do is shake it off. This song sucks. No wonder you people are so grumpy.
So that was his response on X or Twitter. I think it's brilliant. Because his audience there was obviously, in one respect, wrestling fans. Wrestling fans already know he's a heel. They know what to expect. They know to boo him. They'll click on it. They'll like it. They'll whatever. But that Taylor Swift audience who maybe doesn't watch wrestling, who's already mad, they hate him that much more now. And they probably want to see him get beat up. I was immediately noticed this a few hours, like an hour after he posted. I immediately got on the Going Ringside TikTok channel because I'm like, we got to get on this. This involves wrestling and Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce. That is a match made in public relations heaven, in media star heaven. So I got on TikTok, and once again, give us a follow at the @Going Ringside TikTok channel. We're putting exclusive content out there every day that you won't see on the podcast, stuff like this. Hey, I'm Scott Johnson, host of the Going Ringside podcast. Click our link in the profile to hear the show. Grayson Waller has just blown up this whole thing with Taylor Swift after he talked about Travis Kelce and called Taylor Swift just a 6. That got the whole internet ablaze. And then in the last hour or so, he's gone on X or Twitter to apologize, only he didn't apologize. He stayed heel, mocked the people who were outraged by this. He's playing into it, obviously. He knows if he brings Taylor Swift's name, if he brings Travis Kelce's name into his character, that's money for him, that's eyeballs on him, that's manufactured controversy that he gets out of it. He is benefiting from this big time, and if he continues in his character, he will play it through as long as he can. And if he can get Travis Kelce or Taylor Swift to respond at all, expect to see that on SmackDown as the lead story everywhere. So, that happened. Great PR for Grayson Waller. Brought an all-new fan base who might want to tune in and see him get his butt kicked. That's essentially the goal of wrestling. You've already got the diehard fans. If you can bring in other fans, that is essentially the goal of a performer. You know WWE has to be liking this. But where does it go from here? Does he get a few headlines here for a week and that's it? Or like, and I'm sure WWE is talking to him about this in production meetings, do they want to push this further? And do they want to find a way to bring Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift into the WWE universe, even for a guest spot? It looks like they might be trying to get that. Who knows if they'll be successful? Because look what he said as a follow-up on the Bump podcast to Travis Kelce, an explicit message to Kelce, who rumor has it may be a wrestling fan. Why don't you get in the ring and defend her honor? You seem like a good guy. Why don't you come and say something to me about it, lad? He says lad, that's his way he talks. He's originally from Australia. Brilliant marketing. And here's why. First off, let's look at the past. WWE has brought in major A-list football stars before. Starting in the 80s, I think it was WrestleMania 1 or 2, William the Refrigerator Perry, short after he won a Super Bowl, and he's the biggest thing going. WrestleMania 11, Lawrence Taylor, at the peak of his fame, was brought in to face Bam Bam Bigelow at the main event of WrestleMania 11. The fact that I say main event is kind of telling. If you go back and look at WrestleMania 11, kind of the main event that fans were watching was Shawn Michaels versus Sid Vicious. That was the championship match, but that was the second to the last match. Bam Bam Bigelow was not the top star, but Lawrence Taylor was a bigger star than all of them. They made the LT match against Bam Bam Bigelow at WrestleMania 11 the main match on the show. Why? Not because wrestling fans may have been wanting that over Sid versus Shawn, because they knew eyeballs outside of WWF at the time would have tuned into WrestleMania to see Lawrence Taylor. They knew mainstream press would have covered WrestleMania to see Lawrence Taylor. And they knew that would happen. There have been other big stars, Shaq, other guys like that, but they have had other, big football stars over the years, and we knew something like this could be used. So my point being is, if he can antagonize Kelce enough, and possibly if WWE and the price is right and Kelce's willing to do it for a one-off, they can bring in arguably the biggest power couple in the world. If you can have, I've seen some people speculate, does Taylor Swift want to be a manager? Would Kelce perform in one match? He's a good athletic football player. He's a top-level athlete. He could probably handle one match in the ring. And I've seen some people speculate about what pay-per-view it would be. WrestleMania. I mean, you do not put stars like that at Royal Rumble or a monthly pay-per-view, one of your lesser pay-per-views. If you got the biggest stars in the world, you put them at Mania. You build the entire show around them. And I guarantee you, if they're successful, I don't know that they would be. I don't know that Kelce or Taylor Swift would be interested. But if they were, you can guarantee the entire build-up to WrestleMania will be about them. It will be about having Travis Kelce involved. And also look at the timing. Timing is key. When does WrestleMania happen? WrestleMania happens after the NFL season is over. There's probably between Super Bowl and Mania, maybe a month and a half, 2 months. So Travis Kelce, he's on the Chiefs. He's likely going to make the postseason. We don't know how far in the postseason, but they were Super Bowl champs last year. So Travis Kelce will likely, at bare minimum, be playing football into late January. There's one caveat here. You know, how strong is his and Taylor Swift's relationship? We don't know. But if it remains and they could have her in the playoffs, they could have her show up at a Super Bowl, the NFL, which is bigger than WWE by orders of magnitude, puts her on camera as much as possible because they know how big of a deal having her on camera is why you see a lot of non-football fans, a lot of female fans tuning in saying, oh, I want to watch now because I know who Taylor Swift is. Now I know who Travis Kelce is. It's why he's on all the commercials, on all the big-time commercials nowadays. Travis Kelce is everywhere right now. So if WWE can pull this off, Rob Gronkowski, I didn't want to say his name because I was blanking on his name. Rob Gronkowski, they did something with. I wouldn't argue he's as big as Taylor Swift right now because as Travis Kelce, because Gronk isn't dating a megastar. But either way, if you can bring him into Mania, you know, we talk about Roman Reigns, maybe The Rock would return. If you have Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce at WrestleMania, the whole show is going to be built around them. That will be all the publicity. That will be all the talk. So be ready for that. And usually how they do this is they make a deal with them, you know, if they are willing to come, and you maybe agree to be on 1 or 2 shows in a build-up, or you agree to tape this, you know, segment or whatever. WWE would have to negotiate a deal with them to bring them in. And you can imagine WWE, who, by the way, has a bunch of money right now because they just did this merger, and they have UFC kind of in their back, might be willing to do whatever they can to get Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift in. So do not be surprised if this whole Grayson Waller, Travis Kelce, Taylor Swift thing does not fizzle out, but continues. I mean, at the end of the day, it could just be a guy trying to get attention. He's doing a good job of it, and it fizzles out, and it goes nowhere. But you know, when they do WrestleMania, they like to get the biggest stars absolutely possible. And you know, everyone thinks, well, it's got to be The Rock. Yeah, that's true. They might want to get The Rock in at WrestleMania 40. They might want to get guys like Hulk Hogan. Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift is something different. If you can get them right now when they are at the peak of their celebrity. If their relationship wasn't a year ago, it's now. It's today. It is eyeballs on your product. And that is what WWE is all about at the end of the day, is getting people to pay to watch your content, to go buy a ticket, to get mainstream publicity outside of the wrestling world. And Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift could do that. So just something to keep in mind as we watch where this all goes. And we will be watching it, because if Grayson Waller can do this, this will take him to the next level. They often put guys like this with The Miz, because The Miz is really good at working with celebrities. Jerry Lawler was really good in the day at working with celebrities back in the day. And it was really the feather in the cap of Bam Bam Bigelow when he faced Lawrence Taylor. I mean, that was the peak of his career. He main evented a WrestleMania. It didn't really do much for Bigelow afterwards. He kind of just went back into his old school gimmick where he had been, did ECW, did WCW, and Bigelow I don't think he ever was able to capitalize on it, but Grayson Waller might be able to. We'll have to see. So this was just a story that's really popped up in the last couple of weeks that we need to watch closely, because if they are successful, WWE and Grayson Waller, this will be the center of WrestleMania 40. I guarantee it. This will be the center of Mania 40. And I mean, I don't know how into this, if Travis Kelce, I could see Travis Kelce being more agreeable. And there's that rumor that I've seen over the years that Taylor Swift used to babysit Jeff Jarrett's kids back in the day before her fame took over. So maybe she has maybe wrestling's kind of in her heart too. Maybe she's not opposed to it. So we will have to see. And a lot of A-list celebrities over the years have gone to WrestleMania. They may not want to appear on Monday Night Raw as much, but they will go to a WrestleMania because the payday is big, because the eyeballs are big, because they get exposed themselves to a large audience. The biggest audience in wrestling is who tunes in for WrestleMania. And I mean, just broad as far as marketing. I'm not talking about, AEW could argue, well, we had a bigger crowd in London than WrestleMania did. Mania is still the crown jewel. I'm not talking WWE crown jewel like what's going on in Saudi Arabia. Just in general, the crown jewel of the industry. And they may be agreeable to coming there. And Travis will be in the off season, the beginning of his off season. He might be agreeable to do it. Kind of the way Lawrence Taylor was back in the mid-90s. So we will be watching, but that is not the only thing I want to cover on the podcast today. There's something else I wanted to talk about. I've been saving this for a couple months, but stuff keeps happening. Haven't been able to get to it. I want to get to it today, and that involves one of my favorite debates in pro wrestling. The greatest manager of all time. I get on a lot of wrestling websites all the time, and I inject myself in a little debates on who's the greatest manager. You have great ones out there. You have Jimmy Hart. You have Jim Cornette. Cornette's really in the debate on is he one of the greatest. Freddie Blassie back in the day. Miss Elizabeth. Sherry Martel. And some modern ones today. So this really started to get some press here in the last couple months when Paul Heyman did something. Paul Heyman went on Stephen A. Smith's show on ESPN with Roman Reigns, and he was there to promote Roman Reigns, talk about how great Roman is, and Paulie was really he was living the gimmick at that point. He was really playing up the Paul E. Heyman character. And Stephen A. Smith is a very good controversial host. He's one of the best hosts in all of sports. And they start talking about who's the GOAT of managers, who's the greatest of all time. Because historically, in most discussions that I've seen, and I adamantly agree with it, it's Bobby Heenan. Bobby Heenan is arguably the greatest manager to ever live because he was the greatest entertainer. Wrestler, non-wrestler, Bobby Heenan could do it all. He would go out there and he would make you laugh, make you hate him, like no one else ever could. McMahon had him host primetime wrestling. McMahon had him be a commentator. McMahon had him be the manager and the kind of the valet for Andre the Giant at their biggest event ever, WrestleMania 3, when he challenged Hulk Hogan. He was Hulk Hogan's nemesis at Hulk Hogan's peak for a reason, because Bobby Heenan was extremely gifted. Arn Anderson at Bobby Heenan's Hall of Fame speech, I think it was in 2004, said, Bobby is as good as any comedian on television. He's as good as Johnny Carson. He's as good as anyone we've ever seen. And they had him in wrestling. Bobby, if you're a younger fan and have not appreciated Bobby Heenan, I cannot say enough about go watch more of Bobby Heenan. He was just amazing. And when you look at it as far as managerially, the peak of Bobby was being the manager for Andre the Giant when Andre the Giant turned heel and faced Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 3. Arguably the most famous match in the history of wrestling. And he managed everyone. He was Hulk Hogan's nemesis. Big John Studd, King Kong Bundy, Haku, Ravaging Rick Rude, Mr. Perfect, for a time Ric Flair. And then eventually he stepped away from managing, just did the shows, and then he left WWF and eventually went over to WCW. He was one of the lead commentators there, and he gave up managing. Partly because he had a broken neck, and he needed to have neck surgery. He broke his neck in the, I think, early to mid-1980s, was never able to get it finally corrected. He finally had the surgery and was very sensitive about being able to move around. But for those years, Bobby was the best. Everyone looked to Heenan. Everyone hated Heenan. When you put WWF performers on Regis, on Arsenio, on the top shows, the top entertainment shows in the 1980s and 1990s, many times it included Bobby Heenan. He was just gifted. He was arguably, in my opinion, he's the most talented wrestling performer in history. Bobby Heenan was that good. But in the last number of years, Paul Heyman's historical stock has continued to rise. Paulie started in WCW as Paulie Dangerously, and he was a manager there for a lot of guys like Steve Austin, and he had the Dangerous Alliance. I think Rick Rude was part of it for a while. Then he goes and starts ECW. And that's when Paulie really became a legend, because he kind of became a smaller version of Vince McMahon, starting his own alternative wrestling group, competing with WCW and WWF when they were at their peaks in the Attitude and mid-90s when the NWO was around. Paulie really became legendary in the company as a booker. And then he comes to WWE, WWF, WWE after ECW folds. He brings in all his ECW guys, the Dudley Boys, Taz, and then he goes and starts managing this new up-and-coming star, or as he called him, the next big thing, Brock Lesnar. I can't do Paulie justice. And he was Brock's guy for many years as Brock became a champion. And Paulie has been there on and off consistently for years, and now he's Roman Reigns' guy. And he's the lead heel on all the shows. You put Paulie on and it's gold. And there has been talk that Bobby was always here. Has Paulie surpassed him? I mean, is his time with Roman Reigns and Brock Lesnar as good as Bobby Heenan with Andre the Giant and Rick Rude and Mr. Perfect? Well, I want to show you what Paulie said when he goes on Stephen A. Smith's ESPN show a couple months earlier this summer and is asked, who's the GOAT to managers? This is what Paulie had to say.
What is it like to be you?
I'm the GOAT.
The GOAT?
I'm the greatest of all time.
Really?
Yeah, undisputed.
Undisputed? I mean, there was Bobby the Brain Heenan back in the day.
Screw him, he's dead.
Screw him, he's dead. That was in the headlines all over the country. Screw him, he's dead. I mean, that's cold. And when I talked to wrestling fans, you know what they told me? Bobby would have loved it. Bobby would have loved that line. That is similar to Bobby Heenan. Bobby was the ultimate heel, Paulie playing the ultimate heel. And now saying he's the best, the greatest of all time. About Bobby Heenan, screw him, he's dead. So it is a great debate. Is Paul Heyman as good as Bobby Heenan? And are they the only two in the conversation? There's a lot of Jim Cornette fans out there saying, no. And other guys out there, Jimmy Hart, Freddie Blassie, Mr. Fuji. So, Sherry Martel. And some people now. So we want to have that debate. So I reached out to our friends over at the Coming Down the Aisle podcast to join us and talk a little about who's the greatest manager of all time. Does what Paul Heyman said have any merit to it? Or is it still Bobby? Or is it someone else? Here's our interview with our friends from the Coming Down the Aisle podcast, the Coming Down the Aisle podcast, to discuss the greatest managers of all time. Here it is. Well, we're excited to be joined today by John Swallow with the Coming Down the Aisle podcast. John, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be on.
Well, tell me all about Coming Down the Aisle. Tell me all about it, where people can find it. Tell me everything we need to know.
Yeah, sure. You can find me at comingdowntheaislepod.com. I'm part of a network of podcasts, wrestling podcasts called the Pod Foundation. Myself, Chick Foley Show, Extra Cooler, and Turnbuckle Tavern. Each week we dive into wrestling. But my podcast is Coming Down the Aisle, comingdowntheaislepod.com, where you can find a show each and every week, and then we also do a top 10 list every 2 weeks. Top 10 of something, whether it be managers or SummerSlam events or whatever.
Sure. Well, let's get to why we're here, and that is the Paul Heyman shock the world insensitive soundbite that was on ESPN a few weeks ago. So let's set it up for our viewers if you didn't see it. You can go find it. So Paul Heyman is on along with Roman Reigns, is on the Stephen A. Smith ESPN show, one of ESPN's top guys, top shows, very high profile, sitting there with the belt over his shoulders. And he says, I'm the GOAT. I'm the greatest of all time as far as managers are concerned. And then Stephen A. asks him, well, what about Bobby Heenan? A lot of people say he's the GOAT. And without much compunction, Heyman goes, screw him, he's dead. That set wrestling world on the internet on fire. Yes. John, what do you take away from Paulie's comments about the brain?
Well, if you look at it in a kayfabe perspective, he definitely has an argument, right? Kayfabe, if you're not familiar with that term, being, in storyline. I mean, he definitely is the most decorated manager, having managed several world champions, Brock Lesnar, of course, being one. But if you go back way back in WCW, managed Rick Rude, who was at that one time the WCW International Champion, which was their top title at the time. So he definitely has a point. He could be the GOAT. Very, very. But
I want to get to the GOAT part in a minute. I want to get to the insensitivity. He really tweaked a lot of people. What do you think? Do you think he went overboard?
I don't think he did.
You don't think he did?
I don't think he did. It's pro wrestling, first of all. I think Hulk once said, one time something like, "Don't work yourself into a frenzy, or don't work yourself into shoot people." He knows what buttons to press, and then what to incite the wrestling audience, especially the wrestling internet, who very much can be very responsive to comments, whether it be in ring or out of the ring.
I talked to one wrestling friend of mine who immediately said Heenan would have loved that.
I agree. I 100% agree. I mean, if you hear some of the comments that Heenan said at his time, I mean, that could have been construed a certain way.
Sure.
But I think he would have loved it. I mean, he would have been right in line. So
I want to do all greatest managers of all time, but right now I want to do the Paulie versus the Bobby discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So talk to me. I mean, Bobby's Andre. I mean, that's iconic. Mm-hmm. That's as great as it gets. Mm-hmm. But Heyman has been every main guy for 25 years. Who do you think gets it here? Bobby or Paulie?
So personally, myself, and this is, of course, very subjective, Bobby Heenan is actually on my probably top 25 all-time list, performers list.
Just performers in general.
Right.
Hogan, Flair, all those guys.
Right. And the reason is a couple different reasons. Is obviously he can talk. He would be able to get guys over very easily, whether you were Haku or Mr. Perfect, somebody who, maybe wasn't as eloquent on the mic, or just by him being there was elevated. And so it's that, of course, his commentating skills, which Paul was a commentator at one point for a little while in WWE. And then, the way for me, what sets off is his ability to perform in the ring. And that doesn't get really showcased enough. I feel
Bobby could take bumps as well as anyone.
Right. Bobby was a wrestler at one point, and then he transitioned into the managerial role. This was way back in the 50s and 60s is whenever he was wrestling. I think he wrestled around like in circuses and things like that, whenever it was more of a traveling kind of corny promotion type deal.
Yeah.
So he definitely was able to perform in the ring, and he showed some of those skills while he was in WWE, WWF, during the 80s and 90s, partially into the 90s, should I say. But that to me really just sets it off, and he was so versatile. He was a 5-tool player, in my opinion. So, yes, in a kayfabe perspective, Paul Heyman is the GOAT. He's managed, like I said, Rick Rude, Steve Austin, Arn Anderson. That's his all in WCW. Brock Lesnar, Roman Reigns, the Usos.
So let's talk about it. So Heenan's probably biggest managerial role has got to be Andre. Yes. I mean, that WrestleMania 3 is iconic. I mean, that's as high profile as it gets in pro wrestling history. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's got Mr. Perfect. The Flair thing didn't last very long.
No.
but I think Bobby's big ones were the Heenan family
Yes.
and Andre. I mean, when you think Hall, I would say his biggest managerial role was probably Lesnar, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, because and here's a great perspective. I was listening to Broken Open XM radio show anyway, and they were Busted Open. This is what it's called.
Busted Open, yeah.
Yes, and
you were
and,
conflating it with Steve Austin's Broken Skull or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yes, Mark Henry said something that was interesting, that he thinks Brock Lesnar is the second greatest attraction of all time behind Andre the Giant.
Really?
Yeah, and if you think of that, the reason being is Brock doesn't need a title. He doesn't need a championship.
Yeah.
Brock comes in and he's Brock and he's going to draw eyes, much like Andre did. Now, going back to the perspective of Bobby Heenan, especially in that WrestleMania 3 build, all Andre needed was to be aligned with Bobby for that program to get started. Because if you remember, Hulk uttered these words, "What are you doing with this guy, brother?" And immediately that was magic. And we were off to the races. So
I'll say one thing about Bobby that we overlook, because we think about who he managed, but also his feud with Hogan. I mean, that can't be understated. He was essentially Hogan's maybe almost longest nemesis.
Yes. Even until when Hogan turned heel at Bash at the Beach.
Yeah.
Bobby was not sure where, and I know a lot of people say, "Oh, he kind of ruined it." I don't think he did. I think he was in kayfabe just saying, "Well, whose side is he on?" Because I know Hulk. He's not a good guy in kayfabe land, of course. I know who he is, and he's a bad guy basically. So yeah, it's very interesting how that's turned out.
One thing I was wondering about was mainstream crossover, because we see Paulie was on Stephen A. Smith's show, so obviously that's a big deal. But Bobby was on Arsenio Hall. Bobby was on I think the Tonight Show at one point, and Regis and Kathy Lee, kind of the biggest shows of the day, which probably are, even with ratings in the 80s, probably bigger than all these other shows.
Yeah. And I can even remember him being on, as a kid, being on Nickelodeon and things like that. He was everywhere. He was arguably probably like the face of, WWE back then, because he was on almost every program, between Superstars and, well, I guess he wasn't necessarily on Superstars, but he was definitely on the big pay-per-views, primetime wrestling, Monday Night Raw in the early years. He was everywhere. So,
and one thing I cannot encourage our viewers enough, one of my favorite memories as a child in wrestling was when we turned on the show. I didn't know what it was on USA one night, the Bobby Heenan show.
Oh, yes.
His talk show. It's on YouTube. Go back and watch it. It was ahead of its time. Yeah. Bobby was by far ahead of his time. I even heard, I think Bruce Pritchard told the story that USA didn't know what it was, and they didn't tell USA about it. They're like, "What is this nonsense with 80-year-old strippers and Jameson and stuff on our primetime television?" So, let's bring it to beyond just. Well, hang on, one other thing before we move on to all managers. Paulie has it's kind of unfair because he was the booker for ECW, and I mean that kind of made him almost. I mean, it was smaller, but kind of McMahon and Bischoff level, don't you think?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, he's right there in Monday Night Wars. I mean, arguably, WWF, WWE took a lot of things from ECW, so he's kind of very innovative and had a lot of foresight. Didn't have necessarily the money to back everything, but had he could have been toe-to-toe, and definitely could have had a three-way war. Monday Night War.
Let's broaden it out. So the debate lately has been Bobby and Paulie. It's a good debate, but I don't think it's the end of the debate. There are others. Who would you say is in the conversation?
All time. Well, I'll mention this name because he mentioned it right afterwards. So he definitely must think highly, even though he was speaking not very fondly of this person, but Jimmy Hart. Hart is definitely somebody that I think is very influential as far as managerial. I mean, he was there back in Memphis with the Andy Kaufman and Jerry Lawler stuff.
Yep.
Of course, Hart Foundation, managing the original Hart Foundation, managing Honky Tonk Man and Nasty Boys, and into Hulk Hogan.
All his stuff in WCW. I mean, he managed a lot. He managed Dungeon of Doom and all the stuff with Hogan. Yeah, you're right. Jimmy, I don't know that Jimmy was as good of a talker. I mean, he was loud. He had the megaphone and everything.
Right.
As maybe a Bobby or a Holly. But he was everywhere, and he knew how to work, and he knew how to take bumps too.
Right. Yes. I will definitely also say Sensational Sherry Martel.
Yep.
Fabulous manager. I mean, again, somebody who could take bumps. She, of course, was a wrestler as well. And, definitely started the career of Shawn Michaels, Heartbreak Kid.
Well, let's talk about the guy. When I look at this, every time I see people rank these on wrestling fan sites, the one who always discussed next to Bobby, it's not as much Heyman, is James Cornette.
Yes, they're very controversial, of course, with his takes.
Do you think James E. could make the argument that he's the top guy? I mean, he could talk as well as anyone.
Top guy? I don't think so. I think Paul has passed him at this point.
You think? Okay, interesting.
Yes. I mean, and that's mainly because if we're talking, kind of kayfabe, but also behind the scenes things, Paul has done a lot more, in my opinion, for the business than James Cornette has. And that's not speaking, I mean, I would put probably Cornette in the third position, although there's another guy right now that is nipping at his heels, and he's in AEW, Mr. Don Callis.
Don Callis is getting better at it. And Don Callis, I mean, wasn't he the Jackal back in the 90s in WWF? And
had the Jackal.
Yeah.
And then he was also Cyrus the Virus in ECW. Of course, that was pretty much the end of his career until he made his return back in 2015, I believe, and with New Japan Pro Wrestling. So
he's good at it, and people hate him. One I want to talk about that's totally opposite of who we're discussing, but everyone brings her up, Elizabeth.
Yes. She did a lot.
She did, and she was as famous as probably any female ever in wrestling.
Yes, and she's a perfect example. Is you don't have to do too much in wrestling to get over, and that's what she did. She, of course, was beautiful woman, but was with this macho man, right? Mm-hmm. Who kind of ordered around, that they able to get him little heat in the ring, in the squared circle. So, but everybody fell in love with her. Everybody. And just how impactful that reuniting scene was in WrestleMania 7.
Would you consider Kevin Sullivan a manager?
He could be. Yeah. I mean, he would be like a wrestling manager, someone who could manage and wrestle. Definitely towards the twilight of his career when he was with Dungeon and Doom. Because he would talk for guys like the Giant, Paul White. He would talk for, the Faces of Fear, Barbarian, and
the Varsity Club.
And the Varsity Club, yeah. So he could definitely be somebody that would be a managerial.
Do you think managing is a lost art? I mean, you mentioned Don Callis, and Heyman, obviously, but it's just, I mean, I think of those days when on one channel I have Cornette, I have Baby Doll, and then on the other channel I have Hart, I have Heenan, I have Mr. Fuji, Freddie Blassie. It just doesn't seem like, it seems like they got rid of managers for the most part for a long time.
Yeah, they definitely did. Managers were very few and far between. I mean, especially in the early 2000s after WCW closed. I don't think Vince really appreciated that aspect of wrestling.
Why not? I mean, he liked Bobby, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I would probably say at some point he probably wanted the action to be focused in the ring whether somebody was outside or not. Now, he did have a few guys that come in and would have that manager role, like our Alejandro Estrada managed Umaga. And so you had a few guys, but I feel like nowadays things are starting to pick up in the managerial aspect, like Don Callis. But don't forget, MVP is out there. He's doing a really good job with Omos.
I mean, it's great for guys who can't talk.
Yeah, it really is. It's a great tool. One thing I think people realize, especially anybody that's listening, that feels like that they could get into pro wrestling, still sign up for a wrestling school. You definitely have to still be able to take bumps and understand that aspect of wrestling. Then they can kind of get you into a talking role if you feel like that's your passion or where you can give your hand to the business. So that's just from my knowledge of just listening to wrestlers talk and things like that. So I think it's slowly coming back. I think a lot of these wrestling schools are trying to bring that art back. So we'll see what happens. You do have Paul Heyman out there. You have Don Callis. You've got I do like how they have Arn Anderson out there as the coach, and Jake Roberts, of course, guys like that. AEW has done, I think, a really good job at bringing the manager role back.
Before we wrap up, there's one that I think doesn't get enough appreciation because so many people focus on the wrestler. I thought Paul Bearer did a good job.
Oh, man. Paul Bearer, he was excellent. I mean, he did so much for The Undertaker early on that without Paul Bearer, I don't think we would have The Undertaker like we know him today. It was like two peas in a pod. And what was so great is they were able to use that relationship on camera relationship to fuel a further relationship, which was definitely one of the best storylines in pro wrestling, and that is with Kane coming in. So
it was so good. It was so good, and then Foley getting worked into that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then I love the Ministry angle, Ministry of Darkness.
Yeah,
it was
absolutely.
a lot of fun too. Well, it was a lot of fun. Well, John Swallow with the Coming Down the Aisle podcast. Thanks again for joining us. And people, if they want to find you on social media, what social media platform should they look for?
Best one is Instagram, at Coming Down the Aisle on Instagram.
Got it. John, thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks, Scott.
Fun conversation. Thanks to the Coming Down the Aisle podcast for joining us. And if you've got any opinions on who you think the greatest manager of all time is, I'll mention it on the show and that I forgot today. Hit me up at Going Ringside on both Instagram and TikTok. Send me a message, DM me, whatever. And let me know who you think the go-to managers. I thought about Paul Jones, the old guy from old NWA back in the day. Had Paul Jones Army. Ivan Koloff was kind of one back in the day. And there have been others. Sonny, she's had a lot of drama lately, but back in the day, she wasn't a bad manager back then. So just a fun conversation, and don't think this is the last time we're going to talk managers or Bobby Heenan or Paul Heyman. They're obviously going to come up. And the other part of the show, the Travis Kelce, Taylor Swift, Grayson Waller angle, we're going to keep following that. If anything happens with it, we will return to this subject because it will be all the talk of the wrestling world if Waller and WWE can pull something like this off leading into WrestleMania. We will be watching very closely. So thanks for joining us for another episode of Going Ringside. So glad you could join us once again. If you've got this far in the episode, please, please, please spread the word about the show among any wrestling groups or fans you may have contact with. We want to let the show know. And if you know any wrestlers who you think would be good to have on the show, let them know. Get in touch with me at TikTok and Instagram. We'd love to hear from them and have them on the show. So thanks for joining us for another episode of Going Ringside.
This has been Going Ringside with The Local Station, brought to you every Wednesday on your favorite podcast player, on New Sport Jacks Plus, as well as the New Sport Jacks YouTube channel.